Officer Darren Porter sat back in his chair, lazily spinning a pen between his fingers as he glanced around the precinct. It was one of those quiet days, the kind that made him almost wish something exciting would happen. Almost. Darren was known around town as a man who liked to keep things under his control. He prided himself on knowing everyone in the small town of Clearwater. It wasn't a big town, after all. People rarely moved here, and when they did, it didn't take long for Darren to get a sense of who they were. He often said he could judge someone in a matter of minutes. You can tell a lot by the way a person walks, by the way they talk, even by the way they stand. He would brag to his colleagues. And usually, Darren's judgments were firm. Once he made up his mind about someone, it was hard to change it. The town itself was simple, with one main road lined with small businesses, a bakery, a hardware store, a barber, and a few cafes. Most people who lived here had been here for years. Everyone knew everyone, and life was predictable. Darren liked that. Predictability was safe. But that day, something unusual was about to happen, something that would shake Darren's world more than he could have imagined. As Darren leaned back, barely paying attention to the buzzing phones and murmurs around him, the door to the precinct opened. In walked a woman who looked to be in her late 60s or early 70s, dressed in clothes that seemed a little outdated. She wore a worn coat, and her shoes looked like they had walked many miles. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun, streaked with gray. There was nothing fancy about her. She looked like someone who didn't mind blending into the background. At first, Darren didn't even look up. It was his habit to ignore people until they came directly to his desk. He glanced briefly at the woman out of the corner of his eye, then returned to tapping his pen on the desk. She looked like another harmless older lady. Maybe she'd lost her cat, or maybe she was here to ask for directions. Darren sighed. These were the kinds of cases he hated. Small town, petty issues that were beneath him. The woman approached the front desk, her steps slow but steady. She didn't look around like most people did when they entered the precinct for the first time. She didn't seem impressed or intimidated by the bustling officers, the busy phones, or the security cameras watching from every corner. In fact, she walked with a quiet confidence, a calmness that seemed to belong to someone who had been here 100 times before. "Can I help you?" Darren finally asked, not even trying to hide his boredom. The woman smiled, a soft, polite smile. "I'm looking for the officer in charge," she said in a voice that was gentle yet firm. "Well, ma'am," Darren replied, "what do you need help with?" "We're all busy here, so if you can make it quick, that'd be great." The woman didn't seem fazed by Darren's dismissive tone. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression calm and unreadable. "I believe I'll know the person I need to speak with when I meet them," she replied quietly, her words clear and precise. Darren felt a flicker of irritation. People usually knew better than to waste his time, and he didn't appreciate being spoken to in riddles. "Ma'am," he said, a little more sternly, "if you don't tell me what you're here for, then I can't help you. You see, I'm one of the officers in charge here, so if you have a problem, I'm the one you talk to." The woman nodded, her gaze steady. "I see," she said, almost as if she were testing his words. There was something in her eyes, a kind of intelligence, a quiet wisdom, that made Darren uncomfortable. He didn't like it when people looked at him as if they knew something he didn't. Darren cleared his throat, hoping to regain control of the conversation. "All right, ma'am, are you here to report something or not?" The woman took a slow breath, her calmness unwavering. "Yes, I suppose I am," she replied. "But I think it's best if I wait for the right time." This response baffled Darren. "The right time?" he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a police station. We don't exactly run on personal schedules here. Either you have something to report or you don't." She met his gaze, and for a moment, Darren thought he saw a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Thank you for your help, officer," she said quietly. Then, as if their conversation had ended, she turned and walked toward the waiting area, choosing an empty seat near the wall. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked as if she were content to wait there all day if necessary. Darren watched her for a moment, feeling a surge of frustration he couldn't quite understand. Who did this woman think she was? She was nobody important, just another old lady with too much time on her hands, he thought. Yet something about her unsettled him. He noticed that a few of his colleagues were casting curious glances her way, whispering among themselves. "Hey, Porter," one of his colleagues nudged him. "Who's that lady over there? She looks like she walked right out of the past." Darren rolled his eyes. Just another person with nothing better to do, apparently. "She's here for the right time, whatever that means." His colleague raised an eyebrow. "The right time? What's that supposed to mean?" "I have no idea," Darren replied, shrugging. "But if she thinks I'm going to sit here and play guessing games, she's got another thing coming." Still, as the minutes ticked by, Darren found himself glancing over at the woman. She sat there patiently, her face calm, her posture straight. She didn't fidget or check her watch, nor did she show any signs of impatience. She was completely composed, and it bothered him. She didn't belong here, he thought. She didn't fit into his neat little categories of townsfolk he could sum up with a glance. More officers came and went, each casting curious glances her way. Whispers circulated about who she might be, but no one had the nerve to approach her again. There was something about her quiet presence that made everyone feel like she was there for a reason, but no one could figure out what that reason was. As the hours passed, Darren's curiosity grew despite himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Why did she seem so comfortable in a place like this, a police station where most people would be anxious or even intimidated? Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, he rose from his desk and walked over to her. He didn't bother to hide his impatience this time. "All right, ma'am," he said, his voice firm. "You've been sitting here for hours. If you don't tell me what you're here for, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." She looked up at him, her expression as calm as ever. "Thank you, officer," she said with a gentle nod, "but I'm quite comfortable here." Darren clenched his jaw. Comfortable or not, this isn't a waiting room for people who don't have business here. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those steady, observant eyes. "Do you always assume people don't have business just because they don't announce it right away?" Darren narrowed his eyes, taken aback by her question. "Look, ma'am, I'm trying to do my job here, and part of that job is making sure this precinct isn't used as a waiting lounge." She nodded, accepting his words without argument. "I understand, and I appreciate that you take your job seriously, Officer Porter." The mention of his name stopped him cold. He hadn't introduced himself, he realized. He had no badge on display, and his nameplate was on his desk, far from where she was sitting. There was no way she should have known his name. For the first time, Darren felt a shiver of unease. How did you know my name?" he asked, his voice a little unsteady. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at him with that same calm, knowing expression. "Sometimes, Officer Porter, it's important to remember that not everything is as it seems." Darren stared at her, completely baffled. He wanted to question her further, to demand answers, but something in her gaze made him hesitate. It was like she was looking right through him, seeing things he didn't even know about himself. A day at the precinct. It was a typical afternoon at the Clearwater Police Precinct. Officer Darren Porter sat at his desk, tapping his fingers impatiently as he went through some files. It was quiet in the precinct, with officers busy at their desks and phones occasionally ringing in the background. Darren liked it this way, calm, predictable, and under control. He didn't have much patience for surprises or disruptions, especially if they came from people he didn't consider important. Darren believed he could judge people in an instant. He thought he could tell everything about a person from the way they walked, dressed, or spoke. He often shared his views with his colleagues, bragging about his instincts and his people skills. Darren felt confident, almost arrogant, about his ability to read people, and he saw it as one of his strengths as a police officer. So when the door to the precinct opened and an older woman entered, Darren barely looked up. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see her moving slowly, taking cautious, deliberate steps. She looked frail, with thin shoulders hunched slightly forward and a worn-out coat that hung loosely around her small frame. Her shoes were scuffed, and her hair was neatly pulled back into a low bun, streaked with gray. To Darren, she looked like just another nobody. Darren didn't think much of her as she made her way to the front desk. He assumed she was probably lost or needed directions. People like her often wandered into the precinct, confused or looking for something unimportant. Darren didn't have much patience for these cases. He considered them a waste of his time. She finally reached the desk, and Darren looked up just briefly, letting his eyes sweep over her faded clothes and plain appearance. He sighed and decided to go through the routine quickly, so he could get back to his work. Without bothering to hide his irritation, he spoke in a curt, impatient tone. "You lost, lady." Darren sneered, barely glancing at her as he spoke. The woman didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him with a calm, steady gaze. Her silence seemed to throw Darren off, if only for a moment. He felt an odd discomfort as she looked at him, almost as if she were observing him, studying him in a way he wasn't used to. Darren didn't like it. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I'm here to speak with the officer in charge," she said calmly. Darren raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "The officer in charge? Well, that would be me," he said, though he wasn't technically in charge of the whole precinct. He considered himself important enough that he didn't mind stretching the truth a little. After all, she looked like someone who wouldn't know the difference. The woman didn't seem impressed or intimidated by his words. She simply nodded, as if she accepted what he said without question. There was a quiet confidence about her that Darren found slightly unsettling. Most people who came to the precinct were either nervous, fidgety, or overly polite. This woman, however, was different. She stood there, calm and composed, as if she had all the time in the world. Darren shifted in his seat, growing more impatient. "All right, lady, you want to talk to me. Then tell me what you're here for," he said, trying to keep his tone firm and authoritative. The woman looked at him with those steady eyes, her expression calm and unreadable. "I have something important to discuss," she replied, her voice steady and even. Darren rolled his eyes, feeling annoyed by her vague answer. "Listen, if you don't tell me what this is about, I can't help you. I don't have all day to play guessing games," he snapped, hoping to make her realize that he wasn't someone to be kept waiting. The woman didn't seem bothered by his tone. She simply continued to look at him with that same calm expression. "It's important," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. Darren felt his patience wearing thin. He didn't understand why this woman couldn't just get to the point. In his mind, she was wasting his time, and he had more important things to do than listen to someone who couldn't even explain why she was here. "All right, ma'am," he said, forcing himself to keep his voice steady, though there was a hint of frustration in his tone. "If you don't start talking, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We're busy here, and I don't have time for whatever this is." The woman raised her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't look intimidated. In fact, there was a faint hint of a smile on her face, almost as if she found his reaction amusing. "I understand, Officer Porter," she said simply. Her response took Darren by surprise. He hadn't told her his name, and his badge was tucked into his pocket. There was no reason she should know who he was, and yet she spoke his name as if she had known him for years. Darren felt a chill run down his spine, but he quickly brushed it off, telling himself it was just a coincidence. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice sharper than before. The woman simply smiled, a gentle, almost motherly smile that made Darren feel strangely uncomfortable. "Sometimes, Officer Porter, people know more than they appear to," she replied in a calm, measured tone. Darren felt his irritation boiling over. Who was this woman, and what was she trying to prove? He didn't like feeling out of control, especially in his own precinct. He wanted her to leave, to stop looking at him with those calm, knowing eyes that seemed to see right through him. "All right, lady," he said, his tone harsher than before. "If you're not going to tell me why you're here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't have time for this nonsense." The woman's smile didn't fade. She looked at him with a patience that seemed endless, as if she were waiting for him to understand something he couldn't yet see. "I understand, Officer Porter," she said softly. "I'll wait." Without another word, she turned and walked over to the waiting area, choosing an empty seat near the wall. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap, and looked as if she were prepared to wait for as long as it took. Darren watched her for a moment, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. He didn't understand why she was so calm, why she seemed so unaffected by his attempts to dismiss her. Most people would have left by now, but this woman seemed determined to stay. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. One of Darren's colleagues, Officer Ray, walked over and nudged him, nodding in the direction of the woman. "Who's the lady?" Ray asked, a curious look on his face. Darren shrugged, trying to hide his irritation. "Some old lady who won't tell me what she wants. Keeps saying it's important, but won't say why she's here. Says she's waiting for the right time, whatever that means." Ray raised an eyebrow, glancing over at the woman. "She looks like she's got all the time in the world," he remarked, his tone light but curious. "You don't think she's one of those, you know, people who think they know things?" Darren rolled his eyes. "Come on, Ray. She's just some old lady with nothing better to do. She probably thinks this place is some kind of community center or something." Ray shrugged, but there was a thoughtful look in his eyes. "Still, she seems different, don't you think?" Darren scoffed. "Different? She's just another person who's wasting my time. Nothing special about her. Just another nobody." As the day went on, Darren tried to put the woman out of his mind. He buried himself in paperwork, hoping to distract himself from the strange encounter. But every now and then he found himself glancing over at her, wondering why she was still there, sitting quietly with that same calm expression. She didn't fidget, didn't look at her watch, and didn't show any signs of impatience. She simply sat there, as if she were waiting for something or someone. Darren couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for him, that there was something she wanted him to understand. Hours passed, and the precinct started to empty out as officers finished their shifts and headed home. The woman remained in her seat, still calm, still patient. Darren couldn't understand it. Most people would have left by now, but she seemed content to wait as long as it took. Finally, as the clock neared the end of his shift, Darren decided he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, walked over to her, and crossed his arms, looking down at her with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. "All right, lady," he said, his tone exasperated. "It's almost closing time, and you've been here all day. Are you ever going to tell me what you're here for?" The woman looked up at him with that same calm smile. "I believe the right time is very close, Officer Porter," she said softly. "I didn't want to rush you." Darren frowned, feeling a strange mix of confusion and annoyance. "Rush me? I don't even know what you're talking about. You've been sitting here all day, and you still haven't." The woman's smile didn't fade. She simply looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes, as if she were waiting for something he couldn't yet see. "I understand, Officer Porter," she said softly. The days began to blend. The days went by slowly at the precinct, each one blending into the next. Officer Darren Porter continued with his usual duties, meeting familiar faces, filing reports, and keeping his eyes on anyone he considered out of place. He enjoyed his role as a figure of authority in Clearwater, often making snap judgments about people he encountered. To him, they were easy to figure out, simple to categorize. Clearwater was a small town after all, and Darren felt he knew its people well. But something was different lately, something small but undeniable. The old woman he'd dismissed so quickly had started appearing at the precinct more frequently. She came in almost every day now, walking through the door with that same quiet confidence, her posture straight and her gaze calm. She would sit in the waiting area, observing everything with a patient, steady expression, as if she belonged there, even though no one really understood why she kept coming back. Darren didn't like it. He thought it was strange, unsettling even, to see her there every day. But he couldn't figure out what bothered him more, the fact that she kept returning or the calmness she showed each time. She never seemed in a hurry, never seemed irritated by the long hours she sat there. And though she never directly asked to speak with him again, she somehow felt like a constant presence, lingering in his mind even when he tried to ignore her. Each day, he would throw a dismissive glance her way, hoping she would take the hint and leave. He tried not to acknowledge her, even when he felt her eyes on him. Darren didn't want to give her the satisfaction of thinking she was important enough to occupy his time. She was, after all, just another person with no real reason to be there, he told himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Her constant presence was beginning to feel like a test, one he didn't understand. As the days passed, Darren's annoyance with the woman grew. Each morning, as he walked into the precinct, he would glance toward the waiting area, almost expecting to see her sitting there. And each morning, she would sit in the same spot, hands folded in her lap, looking as calm and composed as ever. Darren began to resent her quiet demeanor, feeling as though she was somehow challenging him, though she hadn't said a single word to him since their first conversation. "Still here?" he would sometimes say to her, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Don't you have anywhere else to be?" She would look at him with that same soft smile and nod, as if she understood something he didn't. It infuriated him, though he tried to hide it. Her calmness felt like a silent judgment, a reminder that she was watching him, seeing everything he did. One day, as he passed by her, he couldn't resist making a more direct comment. "I don't know what you're waiting for, but you might as well give up. There's nothing here for you," he said, his tone dismissive. The woman simply looked at him, her gaze steady. "Sometimes, Officer Porter, things take time," she said gently, her voice calm and even. "Patience is a virtue, as they say." Darren rolled his eyes, unwilling to let her words sink in. "Virtue or not, this is a police station, not a waiting room. You can't just sit here forever." She only nodded, not offering any argument. Her patience seemed boundless, and Darren found himself growing more irritated with each passing day. Her presence was like a silent reminder, a steady gaze that followed him even when he wasn't looking at her. Despite his growing frustration, Darren began to notice something about the woman's behavior. She wasn't just sitting idly. She was watching, observing everything around her. Whenever someone entered the precinct, her gaze would follow them, her eyes calm but focused. She seemed to take mental notes, as if she were studying each person who walked through the door. Darren couldn't understand why, but he sensed that she was paying attention in a way that was almost unsettling. One afternoon, as he was processing paperwork at his desk, he noticed her watching a young man who had come in to report a minor incident. She observed the interaction quietly, her gaze shifting between the young man and the officer helping him. It wasn't just a casual glance. There was intent behind her look, as if she were analyzing something Darren couldn't see. "Got nothing better to do than watch people, huh?" Darren muttered as he passed by her on his way to the break room. She looked up at him with that same gentle smile. "Observation can be very revealing, Officer Porter," she replied softly. "It teaches us more than we realize." Darren frowned, annoyed by her cryptic words. "Look, lady, whatever you're trying to see, you're not going to find it here. People are simple. They come in, they go out. Nothing complicated about it." The woman didn't argue. She simply nodded, as if she accepted his words without question. But her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, and Darren couldn't shake the feeling that she saw something in him he didn't want her to see. As the days continued, Darren's frustration grew into something deeper. something closer to suspicion. He couldn't understand why the woman kept coming back, why she chose to sit in the same spot every day, watching everyone who entered and exited the precinct. There was a sense of purpose in her eyes, a quiet strength that made him uneasy. It was as if she knew something he didn't, a piece of information she was keeping to herself. One day, as he was wrapping up his shift, he found himself standing near the waiting area, watching her from a distance. She didn't seem to notice him, or perhaps she didn't care that he was watching her. Her gaze was fixed on a group of officers gathered by the front desk, their laughter filling the room as they shared stories from their day. Darren saw her eyes flicker, a subtle change in her expression that he couldn't quite place. She seemed almost disappointed. He couldn't understand why, but the look in her eyes left him feeling unsettled. It was as if she expected more from them, as if she saw something they didn't see. Darren began to realize that there was more to the woman than he had initially thought. She might have looked unassuming, with her plain clothes and quiet demeanor, but there was a strength in her that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't a loud, aggressive strength. It was quiet, patient, and unbreakable. She didn't need to prove herself, didn't need to demand attention. Her mere presence was enough to make an impact, even if most people didn't notice it. He found himself wondering about her life, about what kind of person she was outside the precinct. She carried herself with a dignity that hinted at a past filled with experience, perhaps even hardship. Darren couldn't shake the feeling that she had faced challenges he couldn't begin to imagine, that she had endured things that would have broken most people. And yet, here she was, sitting quietly in the precinct day after day, watching, waiting. The thought both intrigued and irritated him. He didn't like feeling drawn to her, didn't like the way her presence lingered in his mind, even after he left the precinct. He wanted to dismiss her, to ignore her, but he couldn't. It wasn't long before Darren's colleagues began to notice the woman as well. Officer Ray, who often worked the same shifts as Darren, started making comments about her presence. "That lady's still coming in every day, huh?" he remarked one afternoon, glancing toward the waiting area. Darren nodded, his expression guarded. "Yeah, she doesn't seem to have anywhere else to be." Ray chuckled. "She's an odd one, that's for sure. I wonder what she's waiting for." Darren shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "Who knows? She doesn't say much, just sits there and watches people." Ray looked thoughtful. "She must be waiting for something. People don't just hang around police stations for no reason." Darren didn't reply, but Ray's words stayed with him. He didn't want to admit it, but he was beginning to wonder the same thing. Why did she keep coming back? What was she waiting for? As the days passed, Darren found himself watching her more closely, studying her as she studied everyone else. He began to notice small details he hadn't seen before, the way her eyes followed each officer who walked by, the way she seemed to take in every word spoken around her, the way her expression changed ever so slightly depending on who was speaking. There was a purpose to her presence, he was sure of it, but what that purpose was, he couldn't begin to guess. One afternoon, as he was passing by her, he stopped, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "All right, lady," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Why do you keep coming here? What are you really waiting for?" The woman looked up at him, her expression calm. "Sometimes, Officer Porter, the answers come when we least expect them," she replied softly. Darren frowned, feeling a mixture of frustration and intrigue. Her words didn't give him the answers he wanted, but they hinted at something more, something he couldn't quite grasp. He felt as though she were leading him toward a revelation, something he wasn't yet ready to understand. As the days went on, Darren's frustration turned into a quiet fascination. He began to see the woman in a different light, to wonder about the life she had lived, the experiences that had shaped her. She was no longer just a nobody in his eyes. She was someone with a story she was keeping hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal. She continued, "I know my presence here over the past few weeks has raised questions. I've seen the looks, heard the whispers, and I understand. I wanted to take my time, to observe, to understand this precinct, and the people who make it what it is. The officers exchanged puzzled glances, and Darren could feel his heart pounding in his chest. What was she talking about? Why had she been observing them? The woman paused, letting her words sink in. Then she took a breath, her gaze sweeping over them once more before delivering the news that would change everything. "Allow me to introduce myself," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am Captain Eleanor Hayes, your new precinct captain." A collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by a stunned silence. Darren felt his heart stop, his face going pale. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Captain. She was their new captain. Darren's mind raced as he replayed all the moments he had seen her, all the dismissive comments he had made, all the times he had brushed her off, treating her as if she didn't matter. He felt a wave of shock, embarrassment, and dread wash over him, each emotion more intense than the last. As Captain Hayes looked around the room, Darren realized that her calm gaze was now one of authority, one that commanded respect. She was no longer just an older woman sitting quietly in the precinct. She was their leader, the one who would be giving them orders, guiding them, setting the tone for their work. Darren swallowed hard, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He couldn't believe how wrong he had been, how blind he had been to the truth right in front of him. Captain Hayes waited a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. Then she continued, her voice carrying a quiet strength that left no room for doubt. "I understand that my approach may have been unconventional," she said, addressing the unspoken questions in the room. "But I wanted to see this precinct as it truly is. I wanted to understand the people who work here, to see their strengths and their challenges, and I believe that I've learned a great deal during my time here." She glanced around the room, her gaze passing over each officer. When her eyes met Darren's, he felt his face grow warm. He looked away, unable to hold her gaze, feeling the weight of her observation settle heavily on him. "Leadership," she continued, "is not just about giving orders. It's about understanding, about listening, about seeing people for who they truly are. And I am here not only to lead but to support each and every one of you." There was a pause, a silence that filled the room as her words hung in the air. Darren felt a pang of guilt, his mind flashing back to all the times he had dismissed her, ignored her, and treated her as if she were invisible. As Captain Hayes continued to speak, Darren felt a growing sense of shame. He thought of all the assumptions he had made about her, all the judgments he had passed without a second thought. He had seen her as a nobody, a person with no importance, someone who didn't belong in his world. But he had been wrong. She had been there all along, quietly observing, learning, and understanding more about him and his colleagues than he had ever realized. She had shown him a lesson in humility, a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Finally, Captain Hayes finished speaking, her final words resonating deeply with everyone in the room. "I am honored to be here with you, and I look forward to working alongside each of you as we continue to serve and protect this community." With that, she stepped back, her presence filling the room with a quiet strength. The officers remained silent, processing everything they had just learned, each of them grappling with their own reactions to the shocking revelation. Darren sat in his chair, feeling as if he had been hit by a wave of realization. He looked down, avoiding her gaze, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and regret. He had judged her, dismissed her, and treated her with disrespect, all because he had assumed she was a nobody. But she was his captain, a woman of strength and wisdom, someone who had seen through his arrogance and pride. In that moment, Darren understood the true meaning of respect. He realized that respect wasn't about titles or appearances. It was about recognizing the worth in every person, about seeing beyond the surface. He had failed to do that, and he knew he had a long way to go in learning from his mistakes. As Captain Hayes left the room, the officers began to file out, each one quiet, thoughtful, and perhaps a little humbled. Darren stayed seated, letting the weight of the lesson sink in, feeling the impact of his own actions. For the first time, He saw the precinct through new eyes, understanding that everyone had a story, a purpose, and a place, even those he had been too blind to see. And as he finally stood to leave, he made a silent promise to himself to be better, to see people for who they truly were, and to never again make the mistake of underestimating someone based on his own assumptions. The days after the revelation. The precinct felt different in the days that followed Captain Hayes's big reveal. The atmosphere was quieter, more reflective. Officers who had previously been talkative and carefree now seemed more serious, more focused on their work. The usual banter and jokes that filled the air were replaced by a sense of respect, a new understanding that there were things to be learned, especially from people they might have overlooked before. For Darren, the days after the revelation were uncomfortable, to say the least. He couldn't shake the memory of Captain Hayes standing at the front of the room, revealing herself as their new leader. He kept replaying it in his mind, remembering the look on her face, the way she had looked right at him, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. He felt embarrassed, even humiliated, as he realized just how wrong he had been. He had been quick to judge her, quick to dismiss her as just an old lady with nothing important to say. He had treated her with disrespect, assuming she had no purpose, no value. And now he knew just how mistaken he was. Captain Hayes didn't directly confront Darren about his behavior. She didn't need to. Her calm, steady presence was enough to remind him of the mistakes he had made. Every time he saw her in the precinct, he felt a pang of guilt, a reminder of how he had treated her. He couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes, couldn't find the courage to face her with honesty. In meetings, when Captain Hayes spoke about her vision for the precinct, Darren sat quietly, listening but avoiding her gaze. He didn't have his usual confidence, his usual sense of control. His arrogance had faded, replaced by a sense of humility he had never felt before. Captain Hayes, for her part, laid out her expectations clearly and calmly. She spoke about respect, integrity, and the importance of treating everyone with kindness, regardless of their position or appearance. Her words were simple, but they held a weight that resonated with everyone in the room. She didn't have to raise her voice or make threats. Her authority was quiet, but it was undeniable. As she spoke, Darren felt the sting of each word. He knew that her expectations were meant for him as much as for anyone else. He knew that he had failed to live up to those values, that he had fallen short in ways he hadn't even realized until now. And as he listened, he made a silent promise to himself, to change, to be better, to show her that he had learned from his mistakes. Over the next few weeks, Darren began to approach his work differently. He no longer made quick judgments about people, no longer assumed he knew everything about a person just by looking at them. Instead, he took the time to listen, to understand, to see each person as an individual. He noticed things he hadn't noticed before, small details, moments of kindness, signs of struggle. He saw people in a new light, realizing that everyone had a story, a life outside the precinct, challenges he couldn't see just by looking at them. He began to appreciate the complexity of each person, the unique experiences that shaped who they were. One day, as he was processing a report, a young woman came into the precinct. She looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot, her eyes darting around the room. Darren noticed her hesitation, the way she clutched her bag tightly as if it were a lifeline. In the past, he might have dismissed her as anxious or unimportant, someone with no real issues. But now he saw her differently. He approached her with a calm, respectful demeanor, asking if she needed help. She looked relieved, her shoulders relaxing as she explained her situation. Darren listened carefully, treating her with kindness and patience. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He simply listened, offering support and understanding. As he helped her, he felt a sense of pride, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he was doing his job the right way. He was no longer just an officer. He was someone who cared, someone who took the time to understand the people he served. And in that moment, he felt grateful for the lesson Captain Hayes had taught him, for the chance to grow and become a better person. The changes weren't limited to Darren. The entire precinct began to shift, taking on a new sense of purpose and respect. Officers who had once been quick to judge, quick to dismiss those who seemed unimportant, now took a more thoughtful approach. They greeted everyone who came through the door with kindness, treating each person with dignity and respect. Captain Hayes's influence was subtle but powerful. She didn't need to demand respect or control. She earned it through her actions, her quiet strength, and her unwavering commitment to her values. Her presence served as a constant reminder of the importance of humility, of seeing people for who they truly were. The officers began to follow her example, treating each other and the people they served with a newfound respect. They listened more, judged less, and took the time to understand the stories behind each face. The precinct became a place of empathy, a place where everyone felt valued and respected, regardless of their background or appearance. Darren watched these changes with a sense of pride, knowing that he was part of something meaningful, something bigger than himself. He felt grateful for the chance to grow, for the opportunity to learn from his mistakes and become a better officer. Darren's journey wasn't easy. He knew that he had lost the respect of his colleagues, that his arrogance and quick judgments had damaged his reputation. But he was determined to earn back their trust, to show them that he was committed to becoming a better person. He began to take on extra responsibilities, volunteering for tasks that others avoided. He offered help to his colleagues, supporting them in their work and showing that he was willing to put in the effort. He no longer saw himself as superior. He saw himself as part of a team, a group of people working together for a common goal. As he continued to work with humility and dedication, his colleagues began to notice the change in him. They saw the way he treated people, the way he listened and understood, the way he respected everyone who walked through the door. Slowly, the respect he had lost began to return, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through his actions. Captain Hayes observed his progress quietly, never offering praise or criticism, simply watching as he grew into the person she knew he could be. Her presence was a constant reminder of the lessons he had learned, a silent encouragement that pushed him to keep moving forward. One day, as Darren was finishing his shift, Captain Hayes approached him, her expression calm and steady as always. She stood beside him for a moment, and he felt a surge of nervousness, wondering if she had something important to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Officer Porter," she said, her gaze meeting his, "I've noticed the changes you've made. I want you to know that I appreciate your efforts, that I see the work you've put in to grow and improve." Darren felt a wave of relief and gratitude, a feeling of pride that filled him with warmth. He nodded, unable to find the words to express his thanks, knowing that she understood without him needing to say anything. Captain Hayes continued, her tone gentle but firm. "Remember, respect is earned through our actions, through the way we treat others. You have shown that you are willing to learn, to grow, and that is something I respect." Darren felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of closure and satisfaction. He knew that he had come a long way, that he had earned back the respect he had once taken for granted. And in that moment, he felt a deep gratitude for Captain Hayes, for the lessons she had taught him, for the chance to become a better person. With time, the precinct continued to thrive under Captain Hayes's leadership. The officers worked together with a sense of unity, a shared commitment to treating everyone with respect and kindness. They no longer made quick judgments, no longer assumed they knew everything about a person just by looking at them. Instead, they took the time to listen, to understand, to see the humanity in each individual. Darren became a role model for the younger officers, showing them the importance of humility, of learning from mistakes, of treating everyone with dignity. He shared his story openly, admitting his past mistakes and the lessons he had learned. He wanted others to see that growth was possible, that respect was something earned through kindness, patience, and understanding. In the end, justice was served, not through punishment, but through growth, through the transformation of a man who had once been quick to judge, quick to dismiss, into someone who valued each person he encountered. Darren had faced the consequences of his actions, had learned the true meaning of respect, and had earned back the trust and admiration of his colleagues. Captain Hayes continued to lead with quiet strength, her presence a steady reminder of the values they all shared. Under her guidance, the precinct became a place of fairness, empathy, and respect, a place where everyone was valued, everyone was seen, and everyone was treated with kindness. For Darren, the journey had been long and difficult, but he knew that it was worth it. He had become a better officer, a better person, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he was part of something meaningful, something that truly made a difference. And as he looked around the precinct, seeing the faces of his colleagues, the people he had once taken for granted, he felt a sense of gratitude, a quiet pride, knowing that he had earned his place among them, not through arrogance, but through respect, humility, and understanding. A time for reflection. In the weeks that followed Captain Hayes's arrival, the precinct transformed in ways Darren never expected. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like a steady breeze that shifts the direction of a river over time. Darren could feel it, and he knew others felt it too. It wasn't just in how they treated the people who walked into the precinct, but also in how they treated each other, how they thought about respect, justice, and their own actions. For Darren, every day was now a lesson in humility and reflection. He thought about his past behavior, about the way he used to judge people based on appearance, assuming he knew everything about them. He used to think that respect came from his badge, his title, and his position. But now he realized how wrong he had been. Respect wasn't something you could demand from others. It was something you earned by the way you treated people, by the patience and kindness you showed. Darren found himself thinking back to his first interactions with Captain Hayes. He remembered how he had dismissed her, thinking she was just an old lady with nothing important to say. He had looked at her clothes, her age, her quiet demeanor, and assumed she was a nobody. Now he felt a deep sense of shame when he thought about those moments. He couldn't believe how blind he had been, how he had allowed his own arrogance to cloud his judgment. One evening, as Darren sat alone in his small office, he took a deep breath and allowed himself to reflect on everything he had learned. He thought about the people who had walked through the precinct doors over the years, people he had judged too quickly, people he hadn't really seen. He wondered how many stories he had missed, how many struggles he had ignored simply because he hadn't taken the time to look deeper. Darren's new perspective helped him see the value in every person who crossed his path. He realized that everyone had a story, everyone had challenges and experiences that shaped who they were. It was easy to judge someone based on a first impression, to make assumptions about their character or intentions. But true respect, he understood now, required looking beyond appearances, beyond titles, beyond what was immediately visible. One day, a young man entered the precinct, looking nervous and uncertain. In the past, Darren might have brushed him off, thinking he was just another troubled youth. But now he approached the young man with kindness and patience, taking the time to listen to his story. The young man explained that he had been struggling to find a job, that he was trying to turn his life around but felt discouraged by the obstacles he faced. Darren listened carefully, offering words of encouragement and understanding. He didn't judge or lecture. He simply listened, letting the young man know that he was valued and respected. As they spoke, Darren realized that the young man wasn't so different from himself, that he was just someone trying to find his way in a world that often judged too quickly, too harshly. By the end of their conversation, the young man seemed relieved, grateful even. He thanked Darren for his time, for his kindness, and left with a newfound sense of hope. Darren felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had made a difference in that young man's life, even if only in a small way. Captain Hayes continued to lead with quiet strength, her presence a constant reminder of the values she embodied. She didn't seek praise or recognition. She simply did her job with integrity, treating everyone with the same respect and kindness she expected from them. Her actions spoke louder than any words, and Darren found himself looking up to her. admiring the way she carried herself, the way she treated others. One day, as they were leaving a meeting, Darren found the courage to approach her. He took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. "Captain Hayes," he began, his voice soft but sincere, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've learned a lot from you, more than I can express. You've shown me what it really means to respect others, to see people for who they are." Captain Hayes looked at him with a gentle smile, her eyes filled with understanding. "Darren," she said, her voice calm and steady, "respect is something we all learn, day by day. It's not always easy, and it's something we have to work on constantly. But the important thing is that we keep trying, that we keep learning." Her words resonated deeply with Darren, and he nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He knew he still had a long way to go, that he was still learning, still growing. But he also knew that he was on the right path, that he was committed to becoming the kind of person he could be proud of, the kind of person who truly respected others. Over time, Darren saw the impact of his own transformation on the people around him. His colleagues began to notice the change in him, and they respected him for it. They saw that he was no longer the arrogant, quick-to-judge officer he had once been. He was now someone who listened, who cared, who valued each person he encountered. Darren's journey was a reminder to everyone in the precinct of the importance of humility and growth. They saw that change was possible, that it was never too late to learn from one's mistakes and become a better person. Darren's example inspired others to look at their own behavior, to question their own judgments, to treat each person with the respect they deserved. The precinct became a place of acceptance and understanding, a place where people felt valued, where they felt seen. Under Captain Hayes's leadership, the officers worked together with a shared commitment to justice and fairness. They no longer judged others based on appearances or assumptions. They looked deeper, took the time to understand each person's story. As time went on, Darren became known as a person of integrity and kindness, someone who treated everyone with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. He carried the lessons he had learned from Captain Hayes with him every day, using them to guide his actions, his decisions, his interactions with others. He often thought about the journey he had taken, about the mistakes he had made, about the growth he had experienced. He knew that he was still learning, that he would continue to learn for the rest of his life. But he was grateful for the opportunity to grow, for the chance to become a better person. In quiet moments, Darren would reflect on the values that had become so important to him. Respect, humility, kindness. He understood now that these values were the foundation of true justice, that they were the qualities that made a person truly honorable. As he looked around the precinct, seeing his colleagues working together, treating each other with kindness and respect, he felt a deep sense of pride. He knew that he was part of something meaningful, something that truly made a difference in people's lives. In the end, Darren had learned a powerful lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had learned that respect wasn't about power or authority, wasn't about titles or appearances. Respect was about seeing the value in every person, about recognizing the dignity and worth of each individual. He thought back to Captain Hayes's quiet strength, her calm authority, her unwavering commitment to treating others with kindness. She had taught him more than he could ever express, had shown him the true meaning of respect, of justice, of compassion. As he sat in his office one evening, reflecting on his journey, he knew that he had found a new purpose, a new sense of fulfillment. He was no longer just an officer. He was a person who cared, who valued others, who saw the humanity in each person he encountered. And as he left the precinct that evening, he carried with him a simple, powerful truth. Never underestimate someone based on appearances. Respect doesn't come from rank or title, but from the character that others too often overlook. Darren knew that this truth would guide him for the rest of his life, that it was a lesson he would carry with him in every interaction, every decision, every moment. He was grateful for the journey he had taken, for the growth he had experienced, for the chance to become a better person. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way, armed with the knowledge, the wisdom, and the respect that Captain Hayes had given him. He was ready to make a difference, to bring justice and kindness to the world around him, one small act of respect at a time.